Stand by for broadcast.
You're listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations.
Hello, I'm Squadron Leader Peter Lisney, and in this episode we ask the question, are Royal Air Force leaders born or made?
Now if there's a fire in a hangar, you haven't got time to sit around and have a little circle and kind of chew over what you're going to do and who's got the best idea. You need to get the flipping aeroplanes out and stop the thing burning down.
And my senior SSC said, Willis, I need to have a chat with you about what you did wrong. So he dragged me to the back end of the kitchen, gave me a few clips around the ear.
But that mustn't mean that we must blindly follow people who say, suck it up. Because there are points at which that is just wrong.
Also in this episode, we'll reheat a few stories just in case you missed them. But first, see if you can identify this noise.
Heads up, look it up, heads down, keep walking, heads down, left, right, and your smell
Find out if you're right at the end of this episode. Now, leadership is a core element of RAF training, but can you really make a leader out of anyone? I put this question to a 3-star Air Marshal and a Warrant officer from the Tedder Academy of Leadership. Air Marshal Sir Rich Knighton, Warrant Officer Mark Willis, welcome to Inside Air. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Now, we've got a really interesting topic to talk about today, leadership. And we've seen the adverts on TV from our friends the Royal Navy. And the Royal Navy have this thing, it might be born in Telford, made in the Royal Navy. So what I want to find out today is your feelings and thoughts, and we're going to scoot around. Does the Royal Air Force make its leaders, or are they born?
Okay.
So before we get into that, I just want to, for the benefit of our listeners, just find out a little bit about yourselves and a brief background on your job today. So, sir, can we start with you?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I am Deputy Commander for Capability and People. I've been in the job, 7 months or so now. My background is I was an engineer officer. I joined up from university. I was sponsored at university as a University Air Squadron Cadet. And it is almost 30 years to the day since I started my very first tour as a Jengo at Kinloss in 1993. My first part of my career was very much typically working on squadrons, working with aeroplanes, working with people. Middle part of my career started to become a mix of that and planning. I was station commander at RAF Wittering, and then the last almost 10 years I've really been in strategic planning, strategic leadership and programming across the Air Force and defence actually.
Just to give clarity, so you're a 3-star, and in terms of hierarchy, you work alongside the Chief of the Air Staff. That's right, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm one of 2 deputy commanders in the Air Force. DCOM Ops, Deputy Commander Operations. I'm Deputy Commander for Capability and People, and we both work for the Chief.
Okay, super. Thank you, sir. Warrant Officer Willis, Mark.
So I guess my leadership journey in itself started while I was at school. So being tall, a bit loud, and in fact one of my primary school teachers once accused me of having a voice like a foghorn. But I went home, I didn't really understand what a foghorn was, so I went home and spoke to my gran who brought me up, and I said, the teacher said I've got a voice like a foghorn, Nan, what's that mean? She said, grabbed me by the collar, marched me down to the school, and the teacher soon found out what Willis had a voice like a foghorn. So my journey in leadership started there. I was tall, I was a bit loud, pretty good at football and cricket. So I was a natural choice for looking at the great man theory for becoming the sports captains. So I progressed through there. Joined the Air Force in 1983. So sir, you can come back when your ID's dry. I've done an extra 10 years. So I went to Marham, and my first, after phase 1, phase 2, I went to Marham, and my first leadership experience happened within the 2 weeks of me being there. And stewarding the officers' mess, I got something wrong. And my senior SSC said, Willis, I need to have a chat with you about what you did wrong. So he dragged me to the back end of the kitchen, gave me a few clips around the ear. Now, I can't vouch for that kind of leadership going on today, and it's certainly not the right thing to do in society. But actually, did I learn from it? Yes. Did I make the same mistake again? No. And the senior SSC is still a good friend of mine, so it kind of worked. But again, my first formal leadership experience was what was called GST at RAF Credden Hill at Hereford. It's what JMLC is today. So GST is General Service Training, and JMLC is Junior Management and Leadership course. So I went on this, and I think from my school days I was a little bit arrogant, because I was the captain of the sports teams and everything else. So went on this formal training, and it was a little bit different to what's happening at Halton at the moment, and it was a lot of tactical stuff. So it's a lot of marching your troops across the shark-infested custard and doing that kind of stuff. Anyway, my first lead was a night lead. We camped outside, and they said to me, Willis, we need to get you and your band of men across the shark-infested custard to pick up the casualties. Right, DI. Yeah, right, staff, I'll do that. So I set off. It was going fantastic. The leadership challenge was going really well, just about to achieve it, and the DI slapped me on the shoulder and said, Willis, your lead's over. Oh, what do you mean my lead's over? I said, I'm just about to achieve it. He said, no, your lead's over. Go and brief the guy at the end and tell him. And I couldn't get my head around this. I wanted to achieve. But I went back in the end and gave the lad a brief, which wasn't that good, if I'm honest. And we achieved the task, got back to the camp. The DI said to me, Willis, come here. So in the DI tent, gave me the bollocking of my life. And he said, if you ever do anything like that again, your career in the Air Force is over. He said, and think about this saying, it's all about the team goal, not individual glory. And that has stuck with me throughout my career. And fast forward, I went through all the training and education opportunities at Halton. So I did the AMLC, the IMLC, and the WASP as it was then, and they were great. It sparked me interest in leadership, because when I went back to Halton, it was less about the marching the troops across the battlefield. It was more about the theories and leadership models you could use to make yourself a better leader. But actually, thinking about it, it wasn't really till I moved across to the reserve cadre that I got my first taste of informal leadership training. And I kind of went into the role for various family reasons, but being a mess manager was my trade. Anybody who came through my office door always wanted something. They wanted a function, or they wanted accommodation, or something. So when I came into this job, after the first 2 weeks, my Wing Commander Carl Hartford, came in and he said, Mark, what can we do to make your job easier or better? And being a bit of a reflector, I kind of said, can I have a day to think about it? And I had the day, thought about it, went back to him and said, sir, I said, I've got plenty of practical and tactical level experience of leadership, but I haven't got much academic. And he said, right, okay, leave that with me. 3 months later, I was the first NCO to do the MSc Defence Leadership at delivered by Cranfield at Shrivenham. And that was an eye-opener for me, because everything I was learning, I was being able to put into practice in the job. So that was it. I've kind of analysed lots of commercial and NATO opportunities for the NCO cadre, and I analysed the ICSC-AIR programme for our first Titan warrant officers to go on, and I've done IOD 4 as well. So yeah, I've had a great journey.
One of the important questions to ask is, what is leadership? So I'm going to ask Warrant Officer Willis your definition, and then Air Marshal Knighton.
So I guess there's been an awful lot of definitions of leadership. produced through academics and books. But the one that's always resonated with me is Eisenhower's. And it's leadership is the art of getting someone else to do something you want done because they want to do it. Now, for me, it's a statement, but actually there's so much embedded in that statement. There's emotional intelligence, there's motivation, there's task completion. So all those kind of things for me make it the one definition that's always stuck with me.
That's great. And sir?
I think there are two fundamental parts to leadership. One is to show the way, to lead, to point in the direction. We often don't talk about that, actually. That's about the decision making. It's about deciding where we're going to go. And the second is the taking people with us to do that. Over the last few years, I've thought quite hard about the responsibility and role of when you become more senior in terms of leadership. And the third thing I would add to it, beyond what I've talked about in the past, is that the other aspect of leadership is how you as the leader enable the people in the organisation to do the best they can and to be the best they can be. And it seems to me that nurturing responsibility is a key aspect of leadership. And an example, a sort of description that I heard recently, which I really like, is that in a garden, only the flowers can do the growing. But what the gardener can do is clear the way of the weeds, feed it, water the plant, but only the flowers can do the growing. And I quite like that.
I've got to ask a follow-on question here for our newest recruits that maybe just come in out of Halton, just coming out of Cranwell. So they're not necessarily in a position of defined leadership in terms of rank. What advice could you give someone at the very start of their Royal Air Force career in terms of leadership, their approach?
I would say always ask first, what could I do better? And then listen to what the people in your team say.
Okay.
Yeah, I love that, sir. But I think for me, it's be authentic, be yourself, and bring your whole self to work, and make the most of the opportunities that the Air Force have got. You can get within the Air Force. Yeah.
The position that you're in at the moment, Mark, is you're in a position to be able to change or influence policy and the way we do things as leaders. Sir, you're the person that's under the spotlight. You're the person that's being scrutinised for your leadership. And how does that feel now that you're very much in the limelight compared to 30 years ago as a junior engineer and officer, you're just trying to keep things good? What is that like in leadership terms now for you today?
It's a good question. I think in all circumstances, at any level where you are a leader and you put in a leadership role and got responsibility for leadership, it is always to some extent, you're always to some extent under scrutiny. It is always to some extent a performance. Leadership in my mind is a very human thing. It's about a relationship between two people fundamentally, and we can expand on that in terms of how it works in larger group, but it's always a personal thing, and so you are always to some extent in the limelight and under scrutiny. I think what happens as you get more senior is that to some extent you get a little bit more distant from the people, and that's a thing I think you have to work very hard at as you get more senior, is to make sure that you spend time with the organisation and people in the organisation. I'm here today at RAF Cranwell, having spent half a day with folks in the recruitment and selection and the HR centre, and you get such richness from those conversations and really listening to people. But as you get more senior, the breadth of the problems you face gets larger. To some extent, expectations get bigger, and your ability to directly influence what happens becomes more limited, actually, because it's you working on that wider scale. personally, I've always found that scrutiny, that sense of responsibility, helpful, motivating. For those who know me, one of my abiding motivators is not to let people down, and so actually that scrutiny is something that I kind of it empowers me. It motivates me, but it also motivates me to work hard and make sure I kind of up my game as best I can. I guess the challenge is, or the danger is, that it can become debilitating if you're worrying too much about that.
Well, certainly if you're worrying about who you're going to let down, because at a senior level, you're going to let someone down on every decision, because not everyone is going to agree with everything.
Yeah, but agreeing with the outcome is not agreeing with the decision is not necessarily what it's about. And one of the lessons I've learned through my career is that if you consciously give people a voice, you make sure it's clear that they've been heard, and that it's clear that their perspective has weighed in your decision making, and you articulate that. In almost every case in my career, people accept that because you want to feel heard, and that is a part of the job of the leader, it seems to me, is to make sure you do hear. And when things go wrong, when I think about mistakes I've made, it's when I haven't listened hard enough to the full breadth of perspective and then weighed it. And that's the responsibility of the leader is to decide. And Tony Blair said, when you decide, you divide sometimes. But my experience is if you have genuinely heard people and make it known that you've heard them, actually, generally they respect you for your judgment and consideration.
And do you think we're good at that, sir? Because I agree with you, it's a real valid point, but I guess from my perspective, I see sometimes that you or some of our senior leadership, and I'll include squadron leaders in that bracket, are playing a game to a certain extent, and they say they're listening, they say you're being taken into account, but actually it's a game to them, and they're not authentic in that way that they're delivering.
So there's something paradoxical about leading change in particular. If you're going to be successful at leading change, you've got to be determined. You've got to be absolutely committed to delivering that change. Because if we stopped trying to move forward every time somebody went, oh, that'll never work, I don't like that, humankind would not have progressed. But the paradoxical thing is, at the same time, you've got to be absolutely clear-eyed that in driving forward, you're not going to drive off the edge of the cliff. And you've got to listen to those perspectives, and you've got to hold that determination and commit to people. And if you'll forgive me a little anecdote, there's a book called Good to Great by Jim Collins. There's a story in there about a guy called Admiral Stockdale, who was the most senior American officer who was shot down in Vietnam, and he spent many years, about 7-8 years, I think, in a prisoner of war camp. And when asked what he thought was the biggest problem when he was there, the thing he most feared, he said the optimists. He said you have to have absolute faith that we were going to be released, but you also had to be entirely realistic that it might not be before Christmas, which was what people said. And I think there's a lot in that. It's this commitment to it. Where I think that perhaps, and there are examples, I would say, where we have got that wrong, and I've done this in my career, is where you are trying to move potentially too quickly, or actually you've decided and you've concluded that this is what's going to happen, and you're going to get some kind of noisy dissenters, but actually you get to the point too quickly of driving on without listening to those dissenters. You're not going to necessarily bring everybody with you. It's a key part of leadership, is to bring people with you. But you do, it seems to me, have to listen, and I think we don't always do that as well as we should. And if you'll permit me another story rather than an anecdote, but in my second tour, I was OC aircraft maintenance flight at RAF Coningsby, and I thought, I was kind of thinking quite a lot about this, and I remember being with the station commander, and I started lecturing the station commander on my views on leadership, which didn't do me any harm, I guess. But but what was interesting was we were talking about this issue of consultative leadership and at the other end of the spectrum, kind of shouty, pointy leadership. And the example I used was something we'd been doing with my team in the hangar that week, which was thinking about what happens if there's a fire in the hangar. Now, if there's a fire in the hangar, you haven't got time to sit around and have a little circle and kind of chew over what you're going to do and who's got the best idea. You need to get the flipping aeroplanes out and stop the thing burning down. But what you can do is spend time before the event happens talking to the people who really know how to move aeroplanes around in a hangar, which was not me as Flight Lieutenant OCAMF. And that's what we did. And actually through that, we came up with some different ideas, or the team came up with some different ideas about how we would deal with it in that circumstance. And so come the day, we'd be shouting at each other and getting a thing to do, but we would have done the work to listen and think about the problem beforehand.
So I think we've all heard that expression, suck it up, buttercup, or deal with it, you're in the military. You know, and for me, sometimes I've felt that that's a poor excuse from a leader. How should our subordinates and how should we respond when our one-up, our boss says to us, just deal with it, suck it up?
Well, one of the questions I used to talk to my junior officers about when I was a station commander was, what do you do if you get asked to do something you don't agree with? How do you do that? And it's the same sort of point you're making. And the most thoughtful answers were that from those who said, well, first of all, I try to understand why I'm being asked to do this. I'd be humble enough to recognise that my perspective might not be right, but I'd be confident enough to ask the question why, and I'd be confident enough to try to point out alternative perspectives. And fundamentally, if I'd been listened to and felt I'd been listened to and we got on with it, I would respect the position of that person, and I'd get on with it. But that was having been through that process. But that mustn't mean that we must blindly follow people who say, suck it up. Because there are points at which that is just wrong. And at those moments, that's when, as individuals, we have to look ourselves in the mirror and say, am I happy to do this? Or do I need to actually stand firm? And if I can't get resolution with my boss, then I'm going to have to take it up through a different route. Now, I think those are pretty rare examples in our careers, but I wouldn't want the people listening to it think is ultimately you have to suck it up, because there are circumstances where that is not reasonable and leads organisations into very difficult positions. But we do have a responsibility to be good followers, but we also have a responsibility to challenge what I heard described as respectful dissent in America recently. So we do have a responsibility to do that.
So we did, and I haven't heard the term for a long time, suck it up, to be fair. I think we've moved on as an organisation, I think. But actually, going back to your dissent thing, sir, and the followership and all that, Keith Grint did a bit of work with us with the Leadership Centre 9-10 years ago, and he came up with a 2x2 model, and we call it constructive dissent, but it's the same principle, you know. Push the boundaries with your boss and give them alternatives, and then if the leader makes that decision and get on board with it. If you can't get on board with it, then I agree with what you're saying, so you push it up the line. But I think, I think we've become more people orientated in the majority. I think there are still minorities, and I think that, going back to your fire scenario, so at the end of the day, there is going to be times when, as my old squadron leader used to say, the JFDI.
You don't need to give that.
No, I won't. But there is an element to that, you know, where there's a situation where it's a life or death situation. Perhaps you've just got to do it.
Get down, keep down. Okay,
What
guys,
can you see?
get to the log. Get on your belt buckle and get to that log. You can see it crawl.
In the Royal Air Force, we see around us marvellous examples of leadership and programs being introduced and change going on and change for the best. How can we hold our leaders accountable for important programs when we post them every 3 years?
Well, the problem is actually we post people more frequently every 3 years as well. I have had a view for a long time that particularly in more senior positions, we should keep people in post for longer. And at least 3 years is my view. I think my experience has been through my career is that you can kind of keep the plate spinning for a couple of years. You can, and then if you move on, you're not inheriting all of the implications of the decisions that you made as a leader. As you get stuck into that 3 year point, I think it definitely, or through that into that third year, you really start to feel it. And there are examples where we should be keeping people in post for longer. So we've had a case recently, quite a senior person, opportunity to go and do a course, but and I've spoken to this individual, but I've argued that actually it's more important that that person stays doing the job that they're in, because it's so important to deliver that thing to the Air Force. It's incumbent upon me then and the organisation to make sure we reward people for doing that. And so we've got to have a system that doesn't look at somebody who's been in one place for 5 years and say, well, but they've not really been tested. They've been in one place for 5 years. I think as you get more senior, that's much easier to do. I think as you're more junior, it's okay to gather experience and move around a bit more, and the implications of what you do in terms of change are not as broadly felt. But I really do think as people get more senior, we should be keeping them in post for longer for the reasons I just described. Because
when we have our annual performance reports, they are written by our boss at that day. Yeah. And if we've been posted to another station, that our new boss has no idea of necessarily the impact of previous decisions. So would there be some kind of follow-through or carry-on assessment of past performance long-term?
If I could just throw in there, though, so because I think you've hit on a couple of great points. I mean, you mentioned change earlier, and I didn't pick up on it, but actually, when you're in that mindset of changing people frequently, it's problematic for the non-commissioned cadre to a certain extent. So when I briefed at the Aviator Command Squadron, one of the stories I heard, and I won't go into the trade, but it was a funny story from a warrant officer, and he said, look, I've been in post for quite a while. He said, but I've got a filing cabinet. He said, in that filing cabinet I've got 2 boxes, plan 1 and plan 2. He said, when the new SO2 comes in, I'll pull out box 1 and he'll say, well, Sam, so chuffed you're in. He said, I've been wanting to implement this change for ages, but the previous boss didn't. Plan 1 gets implemented because it looks good on the SO2, and it looks good on the warrant officer because he's playing the game. 2 years later, that boss goes, pulls out plan 2. Now I asked him, I said, well, you're not improving anything. It's change for change's sake. Why are you doing it? So he said, Mark, he said, one key thing. He said, one, it keeps me knowing what I'm doing, basically, without any wild ideas coming from the SO2. But the other thing, he said, I'm protecting my team. Because with all the ideas and the focus on the yearly reports about change, and you have to be you have to force forward change, I think it sets kind of the wrong example. Now I'm all for change when it's the right change to do, the right when it's been analysed, it's been looked at, and something's broken, something's not working. Change is great. But actually, just change for change's sake because it looks good on a report is totally wrong for me.
Yeah, so I really strongly agree with that. If we are in a position, and I know people feel like that sometimes, that somebody who's appointed feels as though they've got to make a change in order to make their mark, and that's not healthy for the organisation. I do have a view, though, that the world around us is changing, and it happens. You don't always notice it, but when you look back on what it looked like 10 years ago in terms of the technology in your pocket, or even 5 years ago, and the way in which things happen and are done in the world, it has moved on. And the idea that we can stand still with that world around us changing and not have some detriment for standing still, I think is probably naive as well. So my point is that evolution and change are part of life, and the question is, how do we respond to that? And it's responding to it thoughtfully, practically, and things that are going to make a difference that really matter. But there's an element also talking to the people. I worked when I was at university as part of my engineering degree on the shop floor at the Royal Ordnance Factory in Nottingham, and I worked on the production line assembling SA-80 rifles in 1989. I should point out those were the ones that actually worked. But what I learned in that moment, and it was almost all women on this production line, all kind of in their 40s and 50s on this production line. But what I learned was the people who knew more about how to make that system work more effectively were those women on that production line. Not the management, not the supervisors, it was the women on the production line who really knew it. And that's who you needed to talk to if you really wanted to understand how to make things better. And that's the smart leader.
The front is clear.
Right straight right, can we have a quick roll, please? Have a look at his back. Can Frankie on this side? Steve, on your call, please.
Everyone ready? We're going to say ready, brace, roll, and move on, roll. Ready, brace, roll.
Okay, head clear, spine clear, point on the back, buttocks, cranium, legs all clear.
Let's come back to the big question here, because you've both have very long careers in the Royal Air Force, and you went through initial officer training and you went through basic recruit training at a time when the world was a different place, and you've seen perhaps colleagues, you've seen colleagues leave, you've seen colleagues succeed and perhaps really shine. Do you believe that leadership can be something that you can teach someone to have, or did those shining stars join the Royal Air Force already as great leaders?
Shall I go first?
Yeah, I'll go. Oh, well, you go first.
You go first.
I'll go first.
You go first.
Well, I guess you've gone back to the born or made question, and I think if you look through history, so Thomas Carlyle in the mid 1800s came up with the great man theory, and when you look at that evolution of leadership. It's gone through the trait theories, the behavioural theories, the contingency theories, to where we are now, and I did a presentation a few weeks ago or a few months ago now, and one of my opening slides is pictures of all different leadership challenges from the news, from the newspapers, from all kinds of social media outlets, and leadership is probably the most discussed topic in the world. Because everything, no matter, just watch the news tonight and see how many times leadership's mentioned, and it's phenomenal. And that goes to leadership theory as well. So we've gone through all that of the thinking it's born. So the great man theory thinks it's born, and then you move through the trait behavioural contingencies, thinking that, well, actually, no, we can develop our leaders. And I think the last academic paper I read on it was around born is 20 to 30% and made is 70 to 80%. And as an organisation, we firmly sit in that we believe we can better develop, or leaders can be developed through training and education. And that's where we as a TEDR Academy sit. We produced Air Publication 7001, RAF Leadership, and in there's some great tools and methods about how you can develop your leadership styles. And on our SharePoint page, we've got a lot of tools that can be used as well. So RAF Mentor Me, the TAL Performance Room, TAL webinars that people have been into. The organisation actually funds what's called the Part Fellowship, which allows people to study at master's level. So there's opportunities within that, within the TEDR Academy space that can help outside of the formal training elements to develop your leadership.
So Mark, what I'm hearing is that for you, leaders in the Royal Air Force are developed, not necessarily created.
Yes.
Okay.
Certainly.
I think that's a really good way of describing it. So I agree with Mr. Willis that it's a mix of capacity and capability that you have through your upbringing, through some natural capability. But I think it's a very negative mindset to imagine that you can't evolve and develop and improve and learn and improve the skills that are necessary. The one thing that Mr. Willis didn't mention, which I would add, is this idea of self-awareness and learning about yourself. And one of the first things I would always say to people is, if you want to be a good leader, you've got to understand yourself and understand what motivates you and understand how you interact with people. And so,
can I just put in there? So you totally agree. It's that emotional intelligence, self-awareness piece. But a friend of mine has a great comment about that, and I'll have to watch my language, I think. But it's all right knowing you're a bit of a idiot. It's what do you do about it? So it's a self-management part. So it's all right. It's the awareness and the management.
That's very true. And so I think there are some characteristics that people have and are born with. They're kind of your natural ability, but you can enhance those skills and learn and evolve and develop your skills and improve the way in which you exploit those skills, those talents, and develop new ones. I think as well as self-awareness and understanding the impact that you have on others and understanding yourself and what motivates you. I mean, really to Mr. Willis's point, there's also real value in just asking people what they think of you. I'm a big fan of 360-degree reporting. I think we should do more of it, and we should pay more attention to it, actually, as leaders and supervisors, both as individuals but also of our team. Because what you can really judge people by is how they respond to that feedback. Somebody said to me many years ago, all feedback is a gift. Because even if you may not agree with it, that person thinks it, and you need to ask yourself, why does that person think it? And use that to power your development and your self-improvement. So leaders are not born, they are made or developed from the character and skills and talents that they have. And actually, I quite like the fact that we're all different, and we can all bring different aspects to the particular challenges of leadership at any time.
And that kind of brings things full circle for your visit today, which started with recruitment and selection, identifying the future leaders.
Yeah.
And that's at every rank, and you're a leader of yourself at the most junior rank.
Yeah, if you go to the hangar here, we're recruiting officers. You put them through tests to see what level of natural ability and talent they've got. But what the Air Force then does is doesn't leave it there. It nurtures it and develops it, and over time improves it, and with experience and the training and wonderful training opportunities that we have in the Air Force, hopefully improves both their leadership and therefore for the whole of the organisation, makes us better as a consequence.
And I think that leads into the leadership pathway for us. So the lead yourself, lead teams, lead change, lead the organisation. But you can't do any of that without, as you said, sir, that understanding of yourself and understanding how you impact on others by some of that stuff that you're doing.
So, born in Telford, developed in the Royal Air Force.
Yes, exactly right. Much more sophisticated than the Navy's approach.
Before you go, I want to ask you, it's a bit of a desert island discs question, this. If you could take one leadership book for a very interesting stay on a desert island, which book would that be?
Yeah, so there's so many to choose from, great leadership books. A great book for me was Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman, because it just rings so many bells with me, self-awareness, self-management, all those kind of things. So that was good. I really enjoyed the Speed of Trust book by Stephen Covey Jr., who spoke at the leadership conference last year. And I like that because there was lots of practical advice on how you could develop trust and build trust within your organisations. But I guess the book that I would take is and it's been with me on my career within the Tedder Academy, and it's James McGregor Burns' seminal book on leadership. It's called Leadership, and he looks at the progression or the evolution of leadership theory, but he focuses on transformational and transactional, which are key to leadership development within the Royal Air Force. So that would be the book I take.
Excellent.
Very good. I don't know, actually. One of the books that I found really quite interesting was Clive Woodward's book, Winning, which he published not long after England won the World Cup in 2003. But it was actually about leadership. It wasn't really very much about the organisation, and Clive Woodward is quite an interesting example of a leader, but there's some really interesting observations in there. Another book that's similar, actually, which was published not dissimilar time, was Rudy Giuliani's book. So he was mayor of New York and wrote a book called Leadership. And as we've seen, Rudy Giuliani has got some interesting characteristics as well. But again, there were some really quite interesting perspectives on that, and they are stories about individuals, and so they're quite human, they're quite realistic, and we all know some of the situations that they were put in. So I might find that quite interesting to go and reread those, particularly knowing about how Rudy Giuliani's life has turned out in future.
For what it's worth, mine is L. David Marquette's Turn the Ship Around.
Yes.
Who, if I can just throw in, we're trying to get for this year's conference.
Oh, brilliant.
So hopefully you'll be able to listen to him.
Brilliant. I'm going to throw a curveball in here at the end. Will we ever see a Chief of the Air Staff who is not aircrew?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. Why will we?
Well, if you look at what is happening with the way in which we deliver air and space power today, it has become less and less about the person, the pilot in the cockpit. And being head of the Air Force is about being the professional head of the service, but fundamentally it's about leading the organisation to be ready to fight and win. And as we become increasingly reliant on technology, increasingly reliant on how we integrate with the other services, and it's about generating that force and that capability, I don't believe that needs to have a pilot to do that.
True meritocracy.
Exactly.
Warrant Officer Mark Willis, Air Marshal Sir Rich Knighton, thank you both so much for being on Inside Air.
Pleasure, loved it, thank you.
Thanks very much, really enjoyed it.
With a look back at some recent news stories for the RAF, I'm AS1 Victoria Andrews with Reheat for Inside Air. 20 RAF engineers have qualified as the service's first dedicated cross-skilled protector technicians, bringing together the traditional roles of weapons technicians, avionic technician and mechanic technician. This in advance of the protector aircraft entering service at RAF Waddington next year. This approach offers greater flexibility when deploying in support of operations overseas. The remotely piloted air system will provide critical armed surveillance capability when it enters service. To sport, where the RAF senior men's rugby team are making final preparations ahead of their inter-services competition, which starts at the end of March. The team have found their form with 2 wins from 2 in their warm-up games. And the women's football team are preparing for the defence of their inter-services title with a training camp in Spain. The 20-strong squad have secured wins over competitive sides here in a series of friendlies ahead of their warm weather camp. Their coach Corporal Hamilton believes the squad are in a good place. That's Reheat for Inside Air.
I'm AS1 Simon Ross with this episode's Name That Noise.
Heads up! Push it up, heads down, keep walking. Heads down. Left, right. Finish your smell, Anton.
That was the sound of recruits conducting CBRN decontamination drills. CBRN, or chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear, is a staple of Phase 1 training for new recruits. It's considered one of the most testing stages for some recruits and one that is feared by many. Recruits enter the room with their respirators on and then remove them for approximately 1 minute. When exposed to the effects of CS gas, there is coughing, spluttering, eyes are running and ears are stinging, but there are no lasting ill effects. Wearing a protective suit and respirator presents a unique set of challenges. Heavy kit is worn from head to toe, restricting the senses of the individual and making simple everyday tasks far more difficult to perform. That being said, the respirator is a life-saving bit of kit, and it gives personnel the confidence that it will protect them in the event of being deployed into a CBRN environment.
That's all for this episode of Inside Air. Please give us a review and subscribe on your favourite podcast app, and join us again soon.
You've been listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations. If you're serving in the RAF and have a story for us, please speak to your unit media and communications officer. Inside Air is written and produced for the Royal Air Force by RAF Media Reserves.